Hello, hello. Is this, yeah, it's on? There we go. All right. The SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice of the University of San Francisco acknowledges our presence on the unceded land of the indigenous Ohlone communities and pays our respects to these traditional caretakers and elders, past, present, and emerging. It's our intention that this acknowledgement plays a role, however small, in a much larger process of confronting the past in order to create a not yet realized future rooted in justice. Welcome everyone to the first event of the spring 2024 semester of the USF SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, where tonight we will learn with renowned scholar James Carroll, Bay Area giant Rabbi Beth and USF's own Professor Alexis Herr in an event titled Antisemitism and the Catholic Church, an Unfinished Moral Reckoning. My name is Aaron Hahn Tapper, and I direct our university's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. And I want to begin by thanking the SWIG JSSJ faculty and staff for their help in organizing this event, particularly Victoria Farlow. Before introducing tonight's program, I'd like to take a brief moment to tell you about our extraordinary Jewish Studies and Social Justice JSSJ program. Founded in 1855, USF is our city's first university. A premier Jesuit Catholic school, in 1977, we became the first Catholic institution in the world to endow a Jewish studies program. In 2008, we became the first university of any kind, Catholic or otherwise, to have an academic program formally linking Jewish studies and social justice. And then in 2019, we added yet another first to our renowned history by forming a new position on campus, that of Rabbi in Residence. In the classroom, we offer a wide range of significant Jewish studies courses, those not found in other educational settings. Beyond the classroom, we offer unique events that are free and open to the public, such as tonight's event. Additionally, this past fall, we launched the first ever graduate-level certificate program in JEDI and JSSJ, Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Jewish Studies and Social Justice, which gives professionals the opportunity to learn from both scholars and activists, offering a blend of academic study and real-world application. Through the SWIG JSSJ program, we believe that education is the best long-term way to create systemic change. Whether one has the time to take a semester-long course or a mere few hours to hear from a single speaker, education is fundamental to making our world better, paramount in shining the spotlight on the margins, on oppressed communities who are mistreated merely because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or any other social identity. The following are the other JSSJ program events we're putting on this semester. Tonight's event is the first in a three-part series on anti-Semitism. The second event in the series will be held in about 1 month, Tuesday, March 26th, and is titled White Supremacy, Anti-Semitism, and Anti-Black Racism. The keynote speaker will be Eric Ward, renowned community organizer and civil rights and racial justice advocate, and he will discuss the foundational connections between American anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism. Following his keynote, Ward will be in conversation with April Baskin, a dedicated organizer and movement leader within the Jewish community for the last 2 decades, and it will be moderated by USF faculty member Professor Bradley Onishi, a scholar on what. Our third and final event in the three-part series will be held on Tuesday, April 16th, and will focus on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Our keynote that evening will be Leo Ferguson, longtime New York City-based activist educator who has worked with Jews for racial and economic justice for more than 2 decades. Aside from this three-part series, we have 2 other significant events this semester. Sunday, April 7th, we'll have our third annual Alvin H. Baum Jr. Memorial Lecture, where we will honor an LGBTQIA+ Jewish social justice activist. This year's lecture, A View of the Epidemic, Seeing the Face of the Divine, will be delivered by Mike Shriver, who has been involved in HIV/AIDS advocacy, activism, program development, organizational development, and public policy efforts over the last 30 years. And then finally, on Thursday, April 25th, we'll have our 14th annual Social Justice Passover Seder, which will focus on anti-racism. That evening, we will tell the Passover story while making connections between the ancient narrative of moving from slavery to freedom and contemporary anti-racist activism. All these events will be held from 6:30 to 8 on campus, either here in McLaren or in Fromm Hall. If you'd like to learn more about these events, please sign up for our monthly newsletter on a document outside on the table. As for tonight's program, Antisemitism in the Catholic Church. USF is a remarkable place. Our tagline, Change the World from Here, is the real deal. With 9,000 plus undergraduate and graduate students, U.S. News and World Report continuously ranks us as the #1 or #2 most diverse campus in the country in terms of race and ethnicity. An educational institution where 1/3 of our undergraduates are the first in their families to attend college. We estimate that 10% of our student body identify as Jewish, and some 25% identify as queer. As stated, we're a school of firsts when it comes to the Jewish community. Since I came to USF some 17 years ago, we in JSSJ have put on well more than 100 programs like tonight. It's worth knowing that this is the first program in that time that has been focused on anti-Semitism. Though I function in the U.S. on the daily as a white cisgender male, my Ashkenazi Jewish identity is core to my being. It is omnipresent for me. And I've largely been comfortable as a Jew on this campus. This said, although I've never spoken about this publicly, I've personally experienced anti-Semitism on this campus a number of times. In fact, intent versus impact is a common mantra in social justice settings, and no doubt many of these anti-Semitic episodes were unintentional, but they most definitely caused me harm. As an aside, all these experiences predated this past semester when I was abroad. A common theme in many of these anti-Semitic experiences, though certainly not all of them, has been Christian hegemony, Christian dominance. Many people don't see the dominant and subordinated patterns that exist all around us, those that make up the systems and structures of our world. I can't tell you how many USF faculty I've met over the years who have downplayed our campus's Jesuit Catholic bona fides, arguing that our campus is far too secular for their liking. Needless to say, one might have to have trouble with their sight if they don't notice St. Ignatius Church when stepping foot on campus. Christian hegemony, in quotes, is how one colleague of mine here at USF recently reacted to my sharing with him some of the challenges I've had as a Jew on this campus. He went on to say that I should be more grateful that our Catholic campus even has a Jewish studies program. I often wonder if he would have said that to a member of a different minority population. One of the core vehicles that continues to drive anti-Semitism take place within the Christian community. The largest of these subcommunities identify as Catholic, and their official representative is the Catholic Church, which leads me to tonight's program. We'll begin tonight's program with a keynote address delivered by James Carroll, who I will introduce momentarily. Immediately afterwards, Mr. Carroll will be in conversation with Rabbi Beth Singer, moderated by Professor Alexis Herr. I'll now introduce Rabbi Singer and Dr. Herr, and once I get off the stage, not to worry, I will be off the stage. Rabbi Beth Singer is the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Senior Rabbi at Congregation Emanu-El, located less than 1 mile from our campus. Ordained at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, she also earned her undergraduate degree from Pomona College. Before coming to Emanu-El, she served as co-senior rabbi at Temple Beth Am in Seattle for 16 years, and prior to that was at 2 other synagogues. Her professional vocation has focused on worship transformation, pastoral care, and social justice work, especially in the realm of homelessness and at-risk youth. She has dedicated herself to making the world a better place for all people. Professor Alexis Herr, who will moderate the conversation, is a scholar of genocide, has dedicated her life to combating genocide and atrocity, and this passion has motivated her educational and professional pursuits, translated into a strong desire to prevent human rights violations. She received her doctorate in Holocaust history from the Strassler Center of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, is the recipient of multiple prestigious fellowships and awards, and has authored books on the Shoah, Holocaust, the genocide in Rwanda, and the genocide in the Sudan, among others. I can also speak to both Rabbi Singer and Professor Herr as people. Both are whip-smart, intelligent, caring, and thoughtful. Thank you for joining us this evening. As for my final introduction, it's my pleasure to introduce James Carroll to you this evening. Mr. Carroll is the author of 12 novels and 9 works of nonfiction. For some 23 years, he published a weekly op-ed column in the Boston Globe. The son of an Air Force general, he has often focused his writing on the subject of war and peace, beginning in 1972, when he was honored with the first Thomas Merton Award. His novels take up World War II, Vietnam, and the Cold War. His 2 novels about the Irish conflicts have reappeared in multiple editions. His nonfiction books include An American Requiem, God, My Father, and the War That Came Between Us, which won a National Book Award. Constantine's Sword, The Church and the Jews, which won the National Jewish Book Award. House of War, The Pentagon, and the Disastrous Rise of American Power, which won the Penn Galbraith Award. His collected Boston Globe columns against the Iraq War were published in 2004, titled Crusade, Chronicles of an Unjust War. For his columns about Israel-Palestine, he has received the 2008 Press for Peace and Justice Award for Americans for Peace Now. In 2012, he was honored the Scripps Howard Journalism Award Prize. In 2022, the online journal Public Seminar, sponsored by the New School, published his 6-part series in responses to Ukraine, Putin's war, and the human future. Needless to say, he cares about our world and works to combat violence and foster peace. Please join me in welcoming James Carroll, and of course Rabbi Beth Singer, but in a little bit, to the University of San Francisco.
Can I do this without dropping it? Make sure, if you can't hear me or if there's an issue with the sound, please wave at me. I'll deal with it. Can you hear me okay? Great. Good evening, my friends. Aaron, thank you very much. Would you join me, please, in observing a moment of silence, lifting up our hearts for all of those suffering in Israel and Palestine tonight. Antisemitism and the Catholic Church, an unfinished moral reckoning. I want to begin by acknowledging the honor it is for me to be here with you, addressing this urgent question. I want to thank Professor Tapper for his warm welcome, your invitation, the honor you've done me. I want to thank Professor Herr and Rabbi Singer for the honor you're doing me and all of us by having this conversation. Half a century ago, I had the privilege of lecturing here at USF as part of this great university's programming against the war in Vietnam. I have valued USF ever since, and the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice is a perfect example of why I have done that. My life as a reform-minded Catholic was sparked, you could say, by the start of the church's moral reckoning with anti-Semitism. My subject tonight is the unfinished character of that reckoning. But the start of that reckoning was a turning point in history and in my own life story. I was a young seminarian training to be a Catholic priest during the Second Vatican Council, which you probably recall, took place between 1962 and 1965. The Catholic Council, a meeting of all the world's Catholic bishops in Rome, had its most momentous achievement in one of the declarations that most severe and most serious gathering of Catholic teachers, in its declaration, Nostre Aetate. Putting it in Latin means you know it was Catholic. Nostre Aetate means in our time. And it was a declaration about the church's relationship with the Jewish people. And its core affirmation was to renounce the so-called Christ killer charge, a slander against the Jewish people. This declaration, saying that the Catholic Church no longer would tolerate charging the Jews as the murderers of Christ, was the Catholic Church's attempt to reckon with what had been laid bare by the Holocaust. Christianity's complicity with the mass murder of Jews required that confrontation with a core doctrine of the church that had underwritten anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism for almost 2,000 years. Nostre Aetate was the linchpin of Catholic reform, the beginning of the most important and significant changes in Catholic life and thought in 500 years. It advanced the magnificent Catholic-Jewish dialogue that it was my honor to be a part of as a young priest, and then for many years after I left the priesthood as a Catholic writer. But my subject tonight takes up, as my title puts it, an unfinished moral reckoning. The magnificent beginning of the Vatican Council's reckoning with anti-Semitism did actually lead to a further purification of Catholic liturgical practice and educational content, as well as a profound sense of trust between Jews and Catholics, which has been made vivid here at USF, especially at the level of leaders and scholarship. And the pontificate of the present Pope, Pope Francis, shows that. And so does the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. Even so, at a deeper level, The church's moral reckoning with anti-Semitism is wholly inadequate, and the Catholic failure to fulfill the promise of the start made at Vatican II must be counted as part of what allows anti-Semitism not only to survive in our world, but actually to rear its ugly head with fresh and frightening new urgency. Of course, alas, we must have in mind the horrors that have unfolded in Israel and Gaza in these months. The grotesque spectacle of Hamas savagery on October 7th was properly recognized as a pogrom, an organized attack on Jews as Jews. The assault was naturally linked to a long history of lethal anti-Semitism, a legacy that made the shock of that day, with many people in America and Europe celebrating Hamas instead of condemning the group, made the shock of that day a transcendent horror, and we haven't recovered from it. The attack was one thing, but the visceral readiness of legions in the very first days after the massacre, especially of the young and well-educated, to scapegoat Jews for their own slaughter, prompted a moral epiphany and feelings of deep shame. That broad manifestation of anti-Jewish contempt forced the recognition that while Hamas has provided an exceptionally hospitable niche in which the virus of anti-Semitism could mutate, Hamas did not generate the malady. This did not begin with Hamas. The long saga of religious and racial Jew hatred is endemic and unfinished. I know, and you do, that the study of history is a warning. At times of transcendent social stress, plagues, economic depressions, political upheaval, racial discord, and emphatically wars, an urge to find a surpassing cause to blame, a goat to scape, can open into the realm of this preternatural hatred of Jews. We also know that there are no direct lines of causality in history. The Holocaust is not the Nakba. There are no exact analogies either. 10/7 is not 9/11. But there are on-running hidden currents that shape events. And such currents do indeed run from the Rhineland and Iberia in the 11th century to, well, Charlottesville, Virginia, and even to the quadrangles of American college campuses in the 21st. Across the centuries, anti-Semitism has shown up as conspiracy theories, as scapegoating for plagues, as myths of global control, whether of finance or the media, as blaming for exploitative capitalism on one hand, and for revolutions against capitalism on the other. And because of the broad perception that the recent rise in anti-Jewish attacks has been sparked mainly by the Israel-Hamas conflict, several points should be emphasized right here at the start. To deny the legitimacy of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. And it is also anti-Semitic to hold that all Jews everywhere are responsible for the actions of the Israeli government. Challenging the loyalty of American Jews for their support of Israel is anti-Semitic. But to support Palestinian human rights and aspirations for a state of their own is not anti-Semitic. Nor is it anti-Semitic to criticize policies of the Israeli government, such as with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken last week, criticizing the ongoing illegal occupation of the West Bank, or, as with President Biden, the indiscriminate Israeli assaults on civilians in Gaza. Not anti-Semitic. But that even such a defining litany as I just gave must be recited reveals an essential confusion about this crucial question, showing that anti-Semitism is not sufficiently understood, either in its current manifestations or in its deep sources. And because this lack of proper understanding is embedded in our culture, anti-Semitism keeps showing up again and again. An instinctive, often unconscious, deeply rooted contempt for Jews is the paradigmatic hatred of the West. What made the murder of 6 million Jews in the heart of Europe defining was not the scale of the crime. Other so-called genocides compare. No, it was the way in which that murder of 6 million was tied not only to the venality of Nazism, but also to the most sacred traditions of Christendom. Christendom. Christ. I am talking about Jesus Christ, whose death is soon to be memorialized by Christians everywhere in Holy Week next month. And that memorializing is at issue. And that's what I want to lift up. Here is the nub. How Jesus is remembered by his people, or rather, how he is misremembered, is at the heart of our present crisis. Please bear with me as I try to explain this. What lies beneath anti-Semitism? A misremembered Jesus does. As if Jesus was not a Jew. In the Christian memory, Jesus was not only murdered by the Jews, but throughout his whole life, he was at war with them, which is why the church went to war against the synagogue, setting this hatred in motion. Here is the well-established point. Hitler's lethal anti-Semitism murdered the Jews, but he could not have done it without this antecedent anti-Judaism that formed a core dogma of the Christian church. Contempt for Jews did not live in the gutters of rank bigotry, but in the sanctuary of sacred doctrine. And rooting that doctrine, the idea that the church had replaced the synagogue in God's favor, supersessionism, replacement theology, divine rejection of the Jews, call it what you will. Beneath that is a particular understanding of Jesus Christ that has yet to change. This problem belongs not just to the church, it belongs to the West, our civilization, which took the structure of its imagination from this innately anti-Jewish Christian faith. And because it did, there are, you could say, spoiled genes in the DNA of our whole civilization, a bug in the software, if you will. This disorder boils down to an us against them division of the human species that, unlike other tribalisms, other conflicts between nation groups, or geopolitical spheres of influence, this conflict is claimed to be willed by God. And the sources of this sanctified Jew hatred are in the gospel. The Christian narratives about the life and death of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Buried in the subconscious of Europe and America is a structure of imagination that still expressly pits Jews against others precisely because the religious imagination of contemporary post-Holocaust Christianity still pits Jesus Christ against the Jews. The first source of this antagonism, of course, is that complaint that the Jews murdered Jesus, a charge that, despite Nostra Aetate and the myriad positive adjustments of Catholic and Christian teaching that Nostra Aetate led to, despite all that, that charge, Christ killers, will be uncritically repeated in Christian churches all over the world next month in Holy Week. The Jews cried out, "Crucify him." The Jews cried out, "Let his blood be upon us and upon our children." But the Christ killer charge became even more explosive when, in the decades after the death of Jesus, he came to be understood by his followers as somehow divine. Jesus was of God. The incarnation, we call this. Jesus is the deity. Therefore, Jews are the deicide people. Deicide, a word coined by a Christian bishop, Melito of Sardis, who died in the year 180. The murder of God is a cosmic crime, impossible to adjudicate. Jewish villainy is unique and transcendent. This slander still undergirds Christian perceptions, even if mostly unconsciously. But there is another problem, less sensational, but perhaps even more damaging, and still unreckoned with. The portrayal of Jesus in memory and in gospel as if he were some kind of Gentile. You've seen the pictures. the long flowing brown hair, his Aryan features, his head never covered. Jesus was not a Jew. He came to his own home, as the Gospel of John puts it, and his own people received him not. Right there. Jesus against the Jews. This is the defining bipolarity of the West, a God-sanctioned anti-Jewish narrative that generates the Gulf Stream current out of which flow the us against them bipolarities that bedevil our history. And of course, this is false. The only ones who received Jesus in his lifetime were his own people, Jews. Jesus himself was a devout Jew. We would say an Orthodox Jew. The God he worshiped was the God of Israel, Shema, the prayer he said 3 times a day, every day. For contingent reasons, complicated reasons, too complicated to go into here, the texts that his early followers wrote about Jesus in the decades after his death, the Gospels, incorporated their late first century conflict with Jesus rejecting Jews into the early first century story of Jesus, a conflict of which Jesus could have known nothing. The Gospels, which were of course written by Jews, derided the enemies of Jesus as the Jews, a phrase that actually means those Jews who disagree with us Jews about who Jesus was. We're all Jews in this. And then soon enough, again for contingent historical reasons, the Gentiles, non-Jews, around the Mediterranean world came to dominate the Christian movement by the middle of the 2nd century. And they read those texts as if Jesus was not himself a Jew. That is to say, the Gentile-dominated Jesus people misunderstood their own foundational texts, partly because they didn't even fully appreciate that those texts that demonized Jews were written by Jews. And so, of course, given the crimes they were understood as having committed, the Jews had to be punished. And one way that happened was through a God-willed ontological denigration of the Jewish people that was made visible, for one thing, by their status as essentially homeless. The Romans, during their anti-Jewish war, culminating in the year 135, had banished the Jews from Jerusalem and the land around it, but the church made that banishment a permanent matter of theology as tangible proof of the claims made for Jesus. The Jews, because they rejected those claims, were condemned to permanent exile. The wandering Jew. And the visibility of their homelessness, the fact that you could see it, was the point. Jews, that is, were forbidden by God ever to be at home in Israel. In Jerusalem. Jerusalem had centered Jewish life and faith for 2,000 years before Jesus. And for the nearly 2,000 years of exile after Jesus, the Holy Land centered the Jewish imagination. Why else did medieval rabbis in Poland constantly pray for rain in the Galilee? Why else do Jews pray at every Passover? Next year in Jerusalem, 1,000 years. And why, given the subliminal echoes of this Christian doctrine of enforced exile, should the Jewish return to Jerusalem in 1948 not have been radically opposed? The subliminal, deeply unconscious rejection of Jews at home in Israel is still at work. The negative-positive bipolarity, Jesus against Jews, church against synagogue, so gripped the mind of Christendom that it eventually licensed the Crusades, a millennium after Jesus, with now Muslims being paired with Jews as Europe's negative other. You remember this from the history you've studied. The Crusades were a multi-century holy war against the infidel far away. But first, they were a war against the infidel near at hand. The very first European pogroms took place in the spring of 1097. Marauding crusaders with the cross on their tunics and on their shields, on their way to the Holy Land, first attacking Jews, killing thousands in Cologne and Mainz and other cities along the Rhine, all in the name of Jesus, their enemy. Gripped by millennial fever, what those attackers wanted was Jewish conversion to Christ. Jewish refusal to convert became intolerable, for an ultimate Jewish conversion had come by the millennium to be theologically defined as the millennial prerequisite for the longed-for return of the Messiah. Unconverted Jews are the obstacle to the fulfillment of history. And once that happens, the Jewish refusal to convert became a cosmic source of Christian anguish. What we're tracking here, and thank you for bearing with me, but what we're tracking here is theological contempt. The deicide charge, the wandering Jew, and now a third transcendent justification for divinely sanctioned contempt. The people guilty of the cosmic crime, murderers of God, had become the people representing the cosmic obstacle to the millennial fulfillment of God's plan for all creation. Embedded below this doctrine, of course, was yet another unconscious reality. Because Christian claims made for Jesus as the longed-for Messiah were based on readings of Jewish prophecy, the Hebrew Scriptures predicting the coming of the Messiah, Christians reading those Scriptures to say that's Jesus, the ongoing Jewish refusal to affirm that, to accept those claims, posed a mortal threat to Christian faith. You say your faith is based on the Jewish texts and what the Jewish people longed for, but the Jewish people say no. How can it be true? The infidels of Islam posed no comparable threat, and neither centuries later in our own time would secularism. No, the Jewish threat, rejecting Christian claims for Jesus, was and is mortal. And it had to be eliminated. Jews had to convert. It was simple. Jews had to accept baptism. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the era of the Inquisition, the church systematically expanded its project of forcing Jewish conversions with escalations of abuse and violence. Finally, many Jews did relent and accept baptism, but an obvious lesson was promptly learned. Coerced conversions cannot be trusted. Coerced conversions cannot be trusted. Soon enough, especially in Iberia, all converted Jews were regarded with suspicion, even if they'd been baptized and confirmed. Misgivings that led ultimately to their no longer being regarded as full members of the Christian community. This denigration, with roots in theology, became a matter of biology. Defining moment, the movement from theology to biology. Anyone born Jewish was, by that fact, a second-class citizen, subject to a range of discrimination. In Toledo, Spain, the first so-called blood purity statute was enacted in 1449, forbidding anyone born a Jew or descended from a Jew from holding municipal office, even if they were baptized and confirmed in the church. And soon, converted Jews and their descendants could not hold office in the church either. They could not be admitted, for example, to the Jesuit order if they were descended from a Jew to the 5th generation. An impediment of origin that was held among the Jesuits in their constitutions until 1946. This institutionalized bigotry marked the transformation of religious anti-Judaism, a long-established doctrinal program, into racial anti-Semitism, which amounted to nothing less than a mutation in human thought. Religion has become biology. This new trope of a social subset's innate genetic inferiority would soon infect the imagination of Christendom itself. And as you know, ground zero of this pivotal shift was the Iberian Peninsula, which in the decades after that Toledo statute was gripped by a kind of anti-Jewish hysteria. That fever broke with the astounding decree by the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, ordering the expulsion of every Jew from the peninsula. The year was 1492. And of course you know this. It is no mere coincidence that the expulsion of the biologically inferior Jews occurred exactly when Christopher Columbus, carrying the mandate of Ferdinand and Isabella, set out on his voyage of discovery. The effective start of the European conquest of so-called New Worlds sent them out across the seas armed with an understanding of their own biological superiority. Christian conquistadors and colonizing settlers felt licensed by God and now by nature to impose themselves on native peoples everywhere they encountered them. When the Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said called anti-Semitism a strange secret sharer of European colonial white supremacy, he was pointing to the fact that the linkage was not merely a matter of coincidence. The two bigotries, each symbolically dating to 1492, anti-Semitism and white supremacy, are related as double effects of the one cause, a cause belonging ultimately to the church, the incubator of our entire civilization. And it began with Jew hatred. Anti-Semitism is the template for European and American racism. Those fascist white supremacists who marched down the streets in Charlottesville, Virginia, made the link explicit. Jews will not replace us. I acknowledge that what I am arguing is, in a way, outrageous, and that a decidedly modern crime and a whole web of crimes attached to it was the denouement of an ancient tragedy whose hero was Jesus. But Jesus perversely misremembered. The misremembering is still at work. To repeat, from Christian pulpits, still, the virtues of Jesus, openness, compassion, egalitarianism, are constantly displayed in the Gospels and in those pulpits, precisely by contrast to his corrupt Jewish milieu, which is rendered as exclusivist, unloving, legalistic. The parable of the Good Samaritan, as the scholar Amy Jill Levine writes, could as readily be called the parable of the bad Jews. Jesus against the Jews gives us gospel against law, the New Testament against the Old Testament, the church against the synagogue, the Easter calendar against the Passover calendar, grace against law, Christian generosity against Jewish greed, Portia against Shylock, ultimately the Christian God of mercy against the Jewish God of vengeance. And finally, it gives us the West against the rest. This is why the igniting portrait of Jesus is set against the Jewish people, his own people, is a far more lethal bipolarity than the simple Christ killer charge. That Christian misremembering is the generating infection that shows up now as what I would call the soul sickness of the West. Yes, attempts have been made to treat this malady. The already noted Vatican Council Declaration Nostra Aetate, renouncing the Christ killer charge. And to take another example, the momentous renunciation by Pope Francis in 2015 of the Catholic mission to convert the Jews. No more converting the Jews, imagine. But the disorder has its deepest roots in the unchanged theology, Christology, that still sets Jesus against his own people. The soul sickness of which anti-Semitism is but a symptom will not be cured without a vast reimagining of Jesus and his meaning. Where would such a transformation begin? How about next month? In Holy Week, the Jews His blood be upon us and upon our children. Crucify him, crucify him. What if, instead of the mindless repetition of the anti-Jewish texts of the Passion narrative, Christian preachers everywhere preached those texts against themselves? What if Christians, learning how those anti-Jewish texts came to be written and that they were written by Jews, learned also to hear those texts as if they themselves were Jews? If you're a Christian and you go to church in Holy Week, bring a Jewish friend with you and ask your friend how the readings struck her. What if the Roman Catholic Church returned to the completion of this repair, this teshuvah, and put it at the very top of its moral agenda, understanding now more than ever the consequences of its failure to complete this? Above all, what if Christians actually and really assimilated the knowledge that Jesus Christ was not a Christian? Period, full stop. Jesus was a Jew. If we had not forgotten that, the history of the last 2,000 years would be very different. Anti-Semitism is not eternal, and it is not inevitable. It is born of history, which is the record of human choices. New choices can write a new history, a history in which explosive and exploding race hatreds can be left behind, a history in which violent force is not the only option, a history in which the welfare of children, all children, can be the supreme value, a history in which ancient enemies can be reconciled, a history for our purposes in this fraught season in which Jewish lives everywhere can be respected. The state of Israel can be secured. Islam can be honored. Palestinians can live in autonomy and peace. Peace. Shalom. Salam. Thank you.
All right. How about now? Everyone nodded at the same time. That was, I feel like that was something. Okay. Before we jump into our conversation, we will hand out some pieces of paper for you to ask any questions that you may have after I get first pick. Great. First of all, thank you so much for that conversation, that talk, and the passion that you had behind it. So much of fighting bigotry, discrimination, anti-Semitism requires passion, and I felt that, and I thank you for that above all else. One of the things that your talk made incredibly clear is that the hatred of Jews, if it's hatred of them as a religion or anti-Semitism, hatred of them as an alleged race, goes way back in time. It's not something that's new. This is something I stress when I teach about the Holocaust. The Holocaust didn't happen overnight. It took pre-existing prejudice in order for a society to move towards the decision in which they believed it was okay and rational to murder 6 million Jews. So with that in mind, I'm asking kind of a strange question of you. I'm curious, what does anti-Semitism look like in your lives today? How do you see it in your congregation? How does it appear in your news feed? And should that give us pause? Does it worry you, understanding that in the past, such prejudice has led to such destruction?
Alexis, is this microphone working? I must admit I can't actually step aside from the present crushing catastrophe that's unfolding between Israel and Hamas. And let me just make one observation that does bring up the question of where in this present heartbreak do we find anti-Semitism? Obviously, in my view at least, and I acknowledge, by the way, in all humility, that what you're hearing from me are my views. I'm not offering some kind of special insight or something. Like all of you, I'm sure, I'm troubled and constantly having to evaluate what I think and how I react. But one of my thoughts about the manifestation of anti-Semitism, in addition to the really kind of jolting first reaction that many people had to the October 7th event, even before the IDF had launched its response to it, I've also been quite troubled by our the way in which we're responding to the Israeli campaign in Gaza, which, just to be fully honest with you, I myself object to. But I'm also an American who is fully attuned to the way in which we responded as a nation to our October 7th, which was, as the analogy has been put forward again and again, which was 9/11. Now, many of you are probably a little too young to have direct memories of 9/11. Maybe not, I wouldn't presume to judge it, but it was more than 20 years ago. The United States of America launched a 20-year-long war in response to 9/11 that was misbegotten, driven more by irrational, unconscious, and vengeful forces and fears that led us into a horrible 2 decades of atrocity. And the United States of America was not subject either to the media sensation or the media focus or the moral judgment that Israel has been confronted with now. Now, again, I'll repeat, I object to the IDF campaign. But I do wonder why, not so much why Israel is being criticized for its campaign, but why it stands alone as a nation being held to a different standard than the United States of America has been. We still have American military forces in 80 different countries. We're still conducting a war against terror. According to the Brown University Costs of War Project, the United States of America's war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, other countries, led directly to the deaths of almost 1 million people, indirectly to the death of many more. is it anti-Semitic to hold Israel to a special standard? As I recall it, as I've studied it, the Zionist wish for the Jewish state was that it would be a normal state, like other normal states. Alas, my friends, Israel is a normal state, like the normal state of the United States. I think that we would do well to ask the ways in which basic unconscious assumptions about Jews, a Jewish state, can be a part of our response to what's going on now. That would be one way to answer your question.
Thank you.
I'll talk in just a moment about my experience as a congregational rabbi with anti-Semitism in this time. But I just wanted to say how amazing it is that you all came tonight, and that we had this opportunity to listen to you, to see so many students, and just if there is any student here who's here because you're getting extra credit in your class to be here tonight, I'm with you. I did every extra credit thing I possibly could do, and it served me very well. So if that's anybody here, it's great that that's a reason that you're here. And we just had a scholar in residence at our synagogue this past weekend. She's Israeli. She came in from Israel, and she stayed at our house. And she's a feminist, anti-war peace activist. And she talked about how lonely it is being in Israel right now as a feminist, anti-war peace activist. And I just listened to you speaking, and to have a non-Jewish person taking us through this history makes us feel a little less lonely, because I think that's something that maybe a lot of Jews are feeling right now during this time, is a kind of a loneliness, feeling misunderstood, not at all being in favor of any kind of killings that are going on of innocent people, and it's very difficult. And of course, as a rabbi of synagogues for the past 35 years, one of the things I do is listen all the time to congregants talking about their own experience of anti-Semitism. And it happens in the street, it happens on the walls, it happens in the workplace, it happens in schools. And there are anecdotes and stories galore of individual experiences of anti-Semitism. Right now, just down the street on Clement and around Clement and 9th Street, someone keeps writing "Kill the Jews" on the walls, and we scrub it off, and they just write "Kill the Jews," and it's on the walls. And kids before October 7th and even now talk a lot about their experiences in school of swastikas being drawn in their math books, and kids saying terrible things. And above and beyond the terrible things and experiences that they have, or when they go to the administration of their school, often public or private school, and the administrators just do not want to take it seriously and tell them to let it roll off of them and not to worry about it. And that feels anti-Semitic. And yet, I don't want to be Pollyannish. When I was thinking about all these examples of modern anti-Semitism in our time, in my own lifetime, for example, public and private schools, I also just think about being in the United States of America and how much at this time in our lives going to public institutions has enabled us to get proximate with people that we've been taught all these things about a particular type of person, and then you go to school, and for the first time you actually meet and become friends with someone who's Jewish, or someone who's Muslim, or someone who's gay, or someone who's a person of color, and you're learning about them, and it's nothing at all like everything you've been taught. And so these same places where anti-Semitism and homophobia and racism and Islamophobia take place are also can be the very places where we're transcending those notions and really learning about people for who they are. So I see both of those things happening.
Great, thank you. It's, yeah, you both have put it so beautifully in different ways. The big level of asking why is there such a focus on Israel-Hamas? It is something that's very important, but it is one of many conflicts that the U.S. is involved in. It's just one of many, and maybe we should be asking the question of why is it getting so much news, right? Why? And then to the smaller level, the local level, right? It's on a wall, right, that you see or you walk by. We have time for maybe one more question, and so I'm going to ask the one that I think is, for me, the most important, which is, right now in history, we're seeing a resurgence of white nationalism. And anti-Semitism is often folded into white nationalism. It's racism and it's xenophobia, and anti-Semitism slots in there perfectly, unfortunately. I'm curious as to what you think we can do as a community, as individuals, to confront that. What would that look like to you? A really easy question for you to answer. Best of luck.
Well, I'll say something obvious and banal, really, which is, I think education, a knowledge of the history, has been extremely helpful to me. I did not understand that white supremacy and anti-Semitism are cousins. And I just tried to explain how that is true, that really sort of world-changing moment in the late 15th century. So 1492, Christopher Columbus arriving in the New World with an attitude he's not even aware of where it comes from, but he has grown up in a world that has thought of Jews as biologically inferior and therefore able to be disrespected and treated as inferior. And that structure of the imagination is what, in my belief, prepared him and other Europeans to respond to native peoples that way. Only 20 years before Columbus went west, another set of caravels, remember those little ships, went south along the coast of Africa. The first European settlement south of the Sahara was in a small peninsula sticking out from the west coast of Africa. They stopped there. They discovered gold there. They established a settlement. They named the settlement after the gold. It's called Elmina, for the mine. And the gold played out pretty quickly, but Elmina was a permanent settlement. And it became the center, the most important trade exporting center of slaves. And it was the same European enterprise going south, going west. And black Africans were subject to the same structure of imagination as Jews were. Now, that's a linkage that is not consciously attended to, but those fellows in Charlottesville, Virginia, had somehow imbibed it. Why in the world, in defending Confederate statues in Virginia, do the Jews come into the story? They don't even know. And why was the operative verb in their slur, Jews will not replace us? Why was it replace? They didn't even know, because they were standing unconsciously on what we Christians have called for 2,000 years replacement theology. We, the church, replaced the synagogue in God's favor. And we've been living in terror ever since by Jewish rejection of our faith, because the Jews No, it's secret in the Jewish prophecies. And as I said, Jewish rejection of Christian claims made for Jesus is mortally, if unconsciously, threatening. Those white supremacists in Charlottesville are Christians. And one of the bizarre things, in my view, about white supremacy and the ferocity of it is that it's cloaked in belief in Jesus Christ. We need to unpack much more carefully and fully than we have the connection between white supremacy, Christian white supremacy, and Christian contempt for Jews.
Thank you.
True. And I think it was only last week in this whole legislation around IVF that that legislators and judges talked about the necessity of inserting Christian theology into decisions that would govern our country. And I think, as you said, just learning and education and here opening our eyes that there is a movement that is very much alive and empowered, feeling empowered to try and elect officials who base the laws of the land on Christian theology. And it's, it's not something we'll ever be able in the future to say, oh, we had no idea. It's really out there. It's very in public. And it's something that all of us as citizens who vote and citizens who can write op-eds in the paper and students in school need to shine a light on it all the time and be very aware that strain is out there. And that this country is a country of refugees and immigrants and people of all different faiths. And that's what's so amazing about living in this country, that I don't want the Jewish faith to dominate this country. I don't want any faith to dominate this country. I just want to be able to live in this country and practice my faith or not practice my faith as I do. And it's going to take all of us, I think, really exposing it and pushing against it to keep that group from prevailing and with their vision of this as a white Christian nationalist country.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Got some questions from the audience. Okay, the first is, why the increase in anti-Semitism on the left in recent years? You thought my questions were hard.
Well, first of all, let me just say, what I'm trying to lift up is the way in which our entire culture is at the mercy of what I called a deformed gene or a bug in the software. There's something preparing us to be in touch with and even express contempt for Jews. And that's true of our culture. It's true of all of us of the West. This religious problem that I outlined, beginning with the Gospels, is the imaginative source of Western culture. So we shouldn't be surprised that it shows up. The particular instance of left-wing anti-Semitism is mostly tied now to the good left-wing impulse to defend the human rights of Palestinians. That is a good impulse. And no one, of course, embraces that impulse more powerfully than many, many, many people in Israel, like your friend. So left-wing contempt for Jews is rooted a lot now in sympathy for Palestinians. But there isn't enough self-examination or self-criticism on the left by what else might be driving it. And why is the attachment to Palestinians so much fiercer than attachment to other oppressed peoples? South Africa brought the genocide charge against Israel. South Africa, to my knowledge, made no particular, or certainly not a high-profile protest about what happened in Darfur in Africa. Alexis is an expert on genocide and knows more about this than I do, but there's a left-wing readiness to demonize the state of Israel that needs to be looked at and criticized by those of us on the left. I am of the left myself, and I'm quite aware of this. On the left, one can even raise a question about lifting up the problem of anti-Semitism, as if to be concerned about anti-Semitism is, by definition, to be uncritically in favor of the government of Israel and its policies. We worry about anti-Semitism as a way of deflecting criticism of Israel. No, not at all. We worry about anti-Semitism because it's the paradigmatic hatred. All the worst hatreds are somehow connected below the surface to this hatred.
Yeah, I would just add this. I was telling a congregant that I was going to be part of this, and she was thinking about her children's experience at a very prestigious private high school here in San Francisco. And she remembered when one of her children during the pandemic was taking their classes at their family home, and so the parents were in and out, and they could hear the teacher teaching, and the teacher was teaching the class, and they heard the teacher say, at one point Jews were oppressed, but now Jews are the oppressor. And they were really just so troubled by that. And I think that is a kind of taken over as a group think in not only in colleges and universities, but in high schools now, and even in middle schools. And even, we heard this story about the woke kindergarten project, and one of the math questions is, if you took all the money that Jews are using to destroy Palestinian lives and you put it to this, how much money would you have? And it's this kind of very narrow, not wanting to be complex and think about and be able to create space to be very critical of Israeli policy, when we're critical of Israeli policy not only against Palestinian people, but also against non-Orthodox Jews, and making a space in Israel for everyone. And I think right now this sort of stream of very narrow thinking has just kind of taken hold, and we can only hope that over time people will return to their senses and want to look critically at all of the different forms of oppression, and not cut Jews out from the idea that Jews are also oppressed, and Jews there are Israelis who can be oppressive and Israelis who are not oppressive.
Yeah, I think the point here is that anti-Semitism is a shade of discrimination. It's one of many types of racism, bigotry, and oppression. And the reality is it's unfortunately seems to be a human impulse to consider ourselves in relation to others. And it's something we should be concerned about. No matter what side of the aisle you're coming from, if that's the impulse, we should be asking questions about it. We only have time for maybe one last question. So I'm going to ask it and hope you can help us answer this one. So this person said, as a Christian raised in this faith and hearing this discussion, is there hope for the reconnection of God's children, all of them, and the greatness or the Genesis to forgive? Do you think we can find a way to align our beliefs and love for our shared God without historic animosity?
I just start by saying I love that question. It's such an important question, and in my personal experience, that's growing up and going to public school and going to college where I just met so many different people of so many different backgrounds. My closest friend in elementary school was Catholic, and I have no idea what her parents said about Jews in their home, but we became friends, and I do believe that there's a whole larger part of American culture that encourages all of us to be who we are, to embrace our form of faith or our ethnicity or our beliefs, and to create space and tolerance, and to be, as I said, to be proximate with people who hold different beliefs and different ideas. And we probably don't have time for this, but I've read, and I was just fascinated because I've gone to churches and sat through church service where these passages, and I'm kind of sitting there and they're talking about the Jews, and I'm feeling a little self-conscious, on Sunday morning. But and maybe this is just too far afield. In a couple weeks after Easter, we're all going to get together around our table and we're just going to go on and on about the Egyptians and how the Egyptians enslaved us, and the Egyptians, were taskmasters, and they were brutal, and then they drowned in the sea, and we're not supposed to celebrate that. And when we tell these stories around our Passover table and we talk all about the Egyptians, we're not at all thinking about Egyptians today. I mean, our brains are really just not at all thinking about people living in Egypt right now. It's a story, and I don't know if there's any place in Christianity where that's something from an ancient story that's told that in no way relates to Jews of today and Jews of our time.
Well, thank you for that wonderful reflection, Rabbi, because that's exactly the point I would make too. Experience weighs more than dogma. And when you have no experience of Jews, all you have is the doctrine that the Jews killed Christ. That doctrine goes unchallenged. But when you're suddenly living next door to a Jew, or you have a friend who's a Catholic, that lucky Catholic, having you as a friend, something else happens. The abstraction becomes real. Abstraction is the enemy here. When we have a real experience of each other, it changes whatever our doctrine is. And that's true religiously. I meant it when I said in passing, we Christians should invite a Jewish friend to come to church with us in Holy Week so that they can hear these texts, so that the Christian can hear the text as a Jew hears them. The doctrine embedded in those texts cannot survive the experience of being with another human being who hears those texts differently. And all religions have troublesome texts. They certainly, if they aren't denigrating Jews, they're mostly denigrating women. They're often denigrating gay people. They're denigrating the other of one kind or another. All religious texts have to be criticized. How do you criticize them? You measure the doctrine they uphold against the experience that you have when there's a real human being involved. And that applies to the Israel-Palestinian conflict too. If we have in mind those children who are now dying in Gaza, not as an abstraction, not as Gazans, not as numbers on a calculation of casualties, but of children, one at a time, one child, one child, one child, one child. It has to make us think again about our assumptions, our abstract assumptions, which is, of course, an easy thing for me to say, and I don't mean to say it from a position of superiority. I don't. I'll say my last word, which is to repeat myself. Forgive me. It's a simple thing that we Christians can do. And those of you who are Christians, if you observe Holy Week, please ask your minister or priest about the texts that are about to be read. Just ask the preacher, how are we supposed to hear this when we read that Pontius Pilate declared that Jesus was innocent and the Jews forced Pontius Pilate to crucify him? Did that really happen, Reverend? If he's educated at all, he knows it didn't really happen. Pontius Pilate was a tyrant, dictator, ruthless man who'd have thought nothing about dispatching a troublemaking Jewish nobody from Galilee. Pontius Pilate was not a defender of Jesus Christ. And there was the crowd forcing the Romans to kill Jesus. Just, if you're a Christian, ask your preacher. It might be a little troublesome, but no, I'm serious. And I'm arguing tonight, that this deep social problem that has lethal consequences is still being nurtured by the uncritical, mindless way in which these texts are repeated and repeated and repeated. I told you I was repeating myself, and I apologize for that. But let me also, my last word is to thank you and to lift up this example. What the Swig Center is doing here is exactly an example of what must be done on all of these issues: theological reform, peacemaking. This is it. This is what it looks like. Thank you.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Wow, great. Thank you. Thank you.